I'm in the role of host, and I'll start, I suppose, by introducing myself. I'm a journalist, and I'm also deeply immersed in training as a facilitator of large group processes to help people heal from trauma. We think of it in terms of individual trauma that we suffer in our lifetime, intergenerational trauma that we can inherit through our ancestral lineages, and also collective trauma, the kind of trauma that we might associate with big historical events in the past, injustices, forms of oppression that live on in our system and in the space between us in the present. But we actually both started as journalists back in the day, both trainees in the training room together, cub reporters, learning our chops. But we've come a long way since that time. Daniel, I've watched go through this incredible metamorphosis, which I would never have predicted when we were working as journalists 20 plus years ago. He's emerged as a leading teacher of yoga philosophy. He has an amazing book out called The Truth of Yoga, which I highly recommend. He also runs fantastic courses, shorter courses, longer year-long immersions, where you bring your unique capacity, in my view, to really make ancient yoga texts, ancient teachings accessible and relevant for people today. And it's really moving to have this opportunity to be in conversation with you about this topic. And I'm excited to see people joining, very much welcoming questions and comments. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to say, Daniel, before we dive into our topic of yoga and collective healing.
Oh, well, I'd just like to say thank you for that very generous and warm introduction. And behind me here on the wall is a gift you gave me for my birthday last year, in which you laid out tarot cards to me. So that's an indication of a journey that you've been on as well. First of all, to have that skill set, but secondly, to hold court at a gathering and read the deck for me. And so I really appreciate the transformation in your own path and the way in which you, through your training in recent years, have really developed a new capacity for facilitation, which is something we've done together with men's groups. And it's kind of what I do in my own way through teaching yoga history and philosophy. But with the focus, I suppose, to a certain extent on the traditions as they've come down to us over the centuries. But most of all, really, it's about coming together in groups to talk to each other about what's alive here and now. And that's when, as you were describing, all of our issues come to the surface in various ways. And, the whole part of yoga is about that process, trying to see the ways in which we are conditioned that cause us to suffer and that, perpetuate suffering in our interactions. And so, the path of realization sounds in some way like, the hermit's retreat to some higher calling, but it's actually about, becoming less of a problem for ourselves and each other by processing our pain, to be honest. That's the entry level point for it. And if we're lucky, getting a glimpse of something higher, but more importantly, being able to face life as it is without running away from it or being triggered by it or acting out in it.
Yeah, I love hearing you say that because it already resonates very precisely with the principles that I've been studying with Thomas Hubel these past few years. I, I noticed what you said about catching glimpses of something higher, because certainly in the training that I'm involved with, or the training is very much informed by a mystical perspective. It's not just a purely psychological approach. We do root the work in psychology, of course, and neurobiology of trauma, but there's always a very strong mystical element of focus on connecting to the light, we would say, or we would talk about the divine. Like there is and the language, as I'm sure you're probably more aware than most, can get in the way, but there's certainly a sense that there is a spiritual resource available for healing. So I just feel there's so many points of connection, and I'm excited that we have this opportunity to go a little deeper, maybe, than in some of the previous conversations we've had about this. But again, really grateful and excited to see so many people joining us in the live stream. Very much welcoming comments, questions, reflections at any moment during this process, which we'll do our best to respond to. So please don't be shy. Do
Yeah.
use the chat. Um, but like maybe we just start off with a very simple prompt. When I talk about collective healing, and you hear that term through the lens of your work with yoga philosophy, what comes up for you?
Well, I think the first thing that strikes me, honestly, and this is looking historically at the evolution of these traditions, is that that hasn't been the focus a lot of the time. It has been a renunciate path, the practice of yoga, with the bar set very high in terms of the objective. Of course, we can question how many people truly transcended material existence to exist solely on the spiritual plane, but there has been an orientation in presenting yoga teachings towards that, and therefore actually a minimization of the importance of social responsibilities. That's the life of the householder. That won't lead you all the way. And there is at the same time, a tradition of householder yoga involving some of those principles, perhaps in what we might think of as a slightly watered down way, which I think is a great thing. I should underline because otherwise we're dealing with fundamentalism, which is actually rejecting a lot of what is to most of us daily life, the reality of life, relationships, commitments, responsibilities, willingness to be part of something bigger than ourselves, in a very worldly way, not just in a transcendent realm. And for that reason, I like talking about how we need almost to create for ourselves language for that, and communities where that can be explored. There is a tradition, obviously, of the ashram and the renunciate life that doesn't go to the cave, but instead, lives in community, exploring these things. There is, of course, this slightly hidden history of practitioners who were worldly in some ways and spiritual in others. And the analog for that might be the person who has a busy, stressful modern life, but is very committed to their morning and evening practices. But that's still not communal, and I think, honestly, what makes it communal is to start to bring dialogue into the whole process, to have the opportunity to hear ourselves by being challenged to speak, and to have, the challenge of listening to others who also feel moved to express themselves, and to see that actually there's many different perspectives on the right way of doing things, many different ideas about what yoga is, and what it is to suffer, and what the healing of that might look like, and that actually a truly yogic perspective has to be able to accommodate that breadth. And there's a lot of instinctive recourse these days to my way or the highway type thinking. It has to be this way or it's wrong. And what I try to do in my own work, but also because I found it really helpful through my own experience with practice, is to make a space where questions are welcome, and where opinions are held lightly but expressed as strongly as people want to express them. And I've found that actually, although traditional yoga texts often say the problem is talking, intellectualizing, worldliness of all kinds that generates all of this agitation that we need to somehow let go of, that actually through dialogue, and then willingness to sit with what bubbles up as a result of it, um, shifts have started to take place for me in my own experience as a practitioner, but also within groups. We've just been through a year of my immersive course, The Path of Knowledge, and it started out as me giving talks about different phases of yoga history, and by the end of it, we've got a group that's interacting independently of me, really speaking open-heartedly about things that are very meaningful in their own experience of life as well as yoga. And that's not down to me; that's down to them, and it's down to the process of being in community. And I think there isn't enough of that in the yoga world. People go to classes and on retreats, but there aren't really other spaces in which conversations of this sort readily occur.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I love how you describe that journey. Like, I think this is one of the conversations that we've had many times about your work, in that in some ways I've almost, like, I like to think I've been prodding you more in the direction of almost recognizing that there can be a like transformational potential when people come together in the way that you convene them. And I love to hear you really embracing that and recognizing that that's really real. And this is obviously the first time you've run that year-long immersion, um, which is a good amount of time for people to start to build that level of trust and intimacy where shifts can start to happen. But I'm also curious about the role of the yoga texts and the philosophy, because of course it's not just any old community talking about any
Yes.
topic. It's very focused on these texts, and I wonder whether there's some kind of transmission or living stream that you feel is almost alive in the space that you're also tapping into.
Well, I suppose I should acknowledge two things. One, that this comes my interest in talking about this stuff from my own practice and my own experience. Since now the late 1990s, when I first went to India, right before we met as trainees at Reuters, and I had got curious about something that I didn't really understand, and it's taken a long time in various different ways to make sense of it. Winding up, back at university when I turned 40 to do a master's degree, and then eventually teaching on that program, which is what led to my year-long course. I had been presenting the curriculum in a very different format, really, but basically covering the same terrain to master's degree students at SOAS, the University of London. And that was a very different sort of, let's say, container, a word we've used sometimes to talk about these spaces in which there is a deepening of connections through a regular commitment to appear in the same space and exchange. And there it was very academic, and I had to present a syllabus to people who wanted to get certified with a master's degree qualification. And so it was lecture format, and it was presenting information from various phases of yoga history. And now, obviously, I've kept some of that in what I'm doing. So I'm trying to present an overview of pretty much everything, which obviously in some ways is deeply unsatisfying because we don't dig one well deep. We dig lots of holes, poke around with a magnifying glass and say, what have we got here then? But what we're doing as part of the course is to try and integrate that by talking about it. And so half of it's me presenting information and sharing things to explore. And the most important bit from my perspective is talking. And in that sense, there isn't really an overarching influence. It's depending on what people are bringing. What I'm using, though, to steer it is my own experience, probably with the most influential teacher in some ways on the last 10, 15 years of my own practice, rather renegade English guy by the name of Clive Sheridan, who has
I've
lived.
been to one of his satsangs.
Yeah, well, indeed, and he's got something going on. Clive has, and that grew out of many years living in India, living in the jungle, and being a wild one, a renouncer, but at the same time not that much because he also had a worldliness, and so I found the bridging of that divide that was there in my mind. I'd spent time around these dreadlocked sadhus at the Kumbh Mela who were really going all the way with that project to the point in some cases of mutilating their bodies to show their commitment to renouncing all physical attachments. Or I'd also then got quite involved in Western postural yoga practice where I was running up against a limit of this is all very nice, but I'm basically just getting a bit bendier and feeling a bit calmer, and that's all good, but why are we doing it, and what does this have to do with traditional yoga texts like the Yoga Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita? And nobody really knew how to explain that. And I suppose what I liked about Clive was that he didn't have a textual focus and yet spoke in a way that, as I read more and more yoga texts, was very consonant with what was in them. So he had integrated through his own practice and reading a way of talking about traditions that were very accessible. And the I guess orientation then that I've taken away from that is to ground what I'm trying to say in serious study. I'm by no means a master of Sanskrit. I'm an armchair Sanskritist who can just about fumble his way through other people's work rather than do my own translation. but enough of a grounding there that I feel like I'm not being led astray by the materials I'm using. And then I'm trying to make all of that scaffolding around what we're looking at fall away to a certain extent. So there's just what we're talking about can stand on its own, but that it is properly rooted in you know, these principles. Let's call it, in terms of that metaphor, architecture that hold it together. But yoga is a discipline that has principles and architecture. It's been structured around ways of seeing and presenting information that have stood the test of time. But if we're not perhaps going to go all the way with the project, we do have to think about how we're going to reinterpret those. And that requires us, I think, to be mindful of what those principles are so that we don't completely dispense with them. Otherwise, we just end up inventing a wholly different thing. And
Mm.
largely that is studio yoga, which is basically a mix of keep fit and feel good. Nothing wrong with that, but that's not necessarily what the word yoga has stood for in the past. And I think, through talking, and Clive was a great talker and liked to encourage questions and discussion, although he always used to say, hold it lightly and enough of all that. And he wasn't best impressed with my decision to go and study at university. It just gave me that sense for intellectual engagement is actually important. It's not just do any old practice and hope for the best. It's what are you practicing? Why? How should you practice it so that that why stands a chance of being realized?
Mm. Yeah, as you say that, it reminds me of another Substack writer, Jessica Bohm, who talks about
Hmm.
philosophical health, and it just feels like there's an element of health, philosophical health in your work. But I'm going to go to a question. I'm very
Hmm.
excited to see so many people in the live, and some of whom are friends of mine, particularly saying hi, shout out to Monica. Good to see you here. And also my colleague Emily. Good to see you. Slightly different topic from what we've just been working on just before this call. Uh, and Jacob Kisher, my great friend and collaborator
Hmm.
as co-founder of The Resonant Man, where we obviously work very deeply with dialogos and transparent communication. So this is very relevant for our work as well. Daniel is asking, Jacob is asking Daniel, what do you think about confrontation, culture war, and the spiritual warrior archetype in this context? And maybe I'll just add a little footnote to that question. I guess in the yoga world, the culture wars are very much alive and well, right?
Hmm.
As I understand it, which means that the dialogue that you're talking about can be quite contentious. It it can
Yeah.
be pretty highly charged at times. So I think maybe that's important context for Jacob's question. But yeah, very curious to hear your response when he asks about this idea of confrontation and the spiritual
Hmm.
warrior as an archetype.
Well, I'm immediately reminded of a title that's given to a practice series in the modern posture yoga world, where I've recently just come back from a festival in Norway, and a friend of mine who was a participant on the year-long course this year, Karina, was teaching Jiva Mukti yoga, which was synthesized by two teachers in the US based on their studies in various disciplines in India. And they actually have a sequence called Jiva Mukti Spiritual Warrior. And they have, through their presentation of yoga teachings, sought to infuse what they're doing with an activist message. And immediately that brings up the question of how do you present information, and how do people receive it? And I remember reading a long time ago now a guy who is I think he's still a Facebook friend of mine, so I see his current output as a columnist for the Spectator in the United States, where he is quite culture war oriented in his focus. But he wrote a book called Stretch. His name is Neil Pollock, in the 2000s, about his experiences getting into Ashtanga yoga. He also wrote another book about his experiences getting really into weed. And I sort of found him amusing. And there's a column I think he originally wrote for Salon or Slate or one of those sites, 20 years ago, about going to a Jiva Mukti class and lying down at the end, all sweaty and tired, and being told to become a vegan, and how he sort of had an argument with the teacher and stormed out. And in some ways, although it was slightly caricatured and deliberately confrontational framing, and perhaps he could have just sucked it up and left and not gone back. Yeah, it was an early precursor to the kinds of conversations that have proliferated online, and I think the earliest flashpoint really that set things off about 10 years ago now was conversations around cultural appropriation. Um, and so that was one early field in which spiritual warriors were active. There were people who were very keen to interrogate, let's say white Western yoga teachers as to their intentions and commitment to respecting the roots of a tradition that they were, I mean, to some extent, mangling, um, often unconsciously, often with no malice intended. But very quickly, I observed that the discourse around that wasn't sort of structured along the lines of we're just sort of friendly reminder. Perhaps learn a bit more about where this stuff comes from and don't just teach the poses. It was quite hostile, and there's a whole sort of 10-year history that everyone's now familiar with about how these positions harden very quickly, naming, public shaming. This is the correct interpretation. That is terrible, and that escalated very quickly among yoga teachers, particularly on Facebook. And there were various public cancellations that resulted from all of that. And I always felt that this defending yoga with what was frankly not particularly yogic conduct was troubling. I didn't really get what the point was, and I started to see more and more instances of that in lots of other contexts. Obviously, the pandemic turbocharged everything with rival factions of, your commitment to serving collective healing is to wear masks, get vaccinated, whatever, and others saying your suggestion that that's what I should do is tantamount to authoritarian takeover, and I'm going to resist this very strongly, which then obviously led to people promoting all sorts of let's say unsubstantiated theories about things. And others also arguing then that what they were being told to comply with was unsubstantiated theory. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but it was, for me, very interesting to see all that happening among yoga teachers and the way in which communication very quickly got very hostile. And it seemed to me actually that a lot of the purported benefits of yoga practice were not immediately apparent in the discourse. And he used the phrase transparent communication. And you've taught me a lot about that through your training with Thomas Hubel, and then the ways in which we drew on some of that in running men's groups together initially. And I guess a lot of what I do in hosting sessions that make use of breakout rooms where people are encouraged to speak and listen to each other carefully, tries to integrate some of that. Others have presented more structured approaches to it under the heading of non-violent communication. But the foundational ethical precept of yoga philosophy is non-harming, in thoughts, words, and deeds. So, to some extent, if one isn't actually trying to uphold that and is instead decided, as many people who think of themselves as spiritual warriors now would say, that actually what matters is saying the uncomfortable truths. Don't tone police me. I just don't get how that is in any way aligned with yoga. Then you just become a shouty activist and own it, but don't bring yoga into it, because yoga is pointing to something subtler, and it's not saying disappear into your bliss bubble where it's all rainbows and unicorns and don't pretend there's anything awkward out there, but bring a modicum of skill to the conversation. Otherwise, there is no obvious benefit to practicing yoga in my mind. If it's only good for the cave and doesn't take off the sharp edges in day-to-day interactions, why are we bothering?
Yeah, that's very aligned with the approach we take in the work with Thomas Hubel. I mean, he always talks about being a mystic in the marketplace, like bringing this kind of work. And we talk about, I mentioned it, you mentioned it, transparent communication is really core to that work. And the principle, for those who maybe aren't familiar with the term, is really speaking from your experience. Like, how do I feel about something? How do I feel physically in my body? What do I think? And what's coming up for me in relation to what's being shared? And so much of the time we go into talking about and advancing a mental position,
Hmm.
but which takes us nowhere. When with transparent communication, we can come into much more attuned relationship with each other, and that's when something maybe starts to happen that might not happen otherwise. And I really feel how you've created the conditions for that process to really alchemize and transform the experience of people in your classes, especially this year long immersion. But let me ask you about let's take it like to a deeper level with the yoga philosophy,
Hmm.
because a lot of what I'm interested in, and again, the language is limited and it doesn't always capture the nuance and subtlety of what, like, the map is never the territory, as we know,
Yeah.
right? But the kind of framing that has been my entry into, let's call it spiritual work, is trauma that, as I mentioned at the beginning, could be something we've suffered in our individual biography, is part of some ancestral pattern, or is a collective experience. The origin of the work with Thomas Hubel was with Holocaust survivors and their descendants, when it was recognized very clearly that people who had grown up in the US or in Israel or other parts of the world who'd never been near the concentration camps had nonetheless experienced many of the same symptoms as their parents who had. And of course, that mechanism or that transmission can occur in many other communities. And, I would argue that, like, we all have some fragment of collective trauma of some kind in our system. But I wonder, like, what does yoga philosophy have to tell us about trauma?
Well, I mean, in the words of Patanjali, who's probably the most quoted yogic sage, in that he wrote this text, the Yoga Sutra, that people certainly in the modern yoga world sort of think of as the Yoga Bible. Although, it's quite detached from a lot of what's happening in the yoga world. It's basically an advanced meditation manual with an analysis of why our minds are structured in such a way as to make that difficult. But it says, if you really are discerning, you will recognize that everything is suffering. So he goes one step further than the Buddha, really, and basically says, until you're prepared to stare it in the face, you are a machine for generating traumatic experience. And at the same time, he then immediately says in the following sutra, these little pithy statements sort of strung together, 195 of them, barely as long as a newspaper feature. He says, well, the suffering that hasn't yet occurred is to be avoided. So there is this juxtaposition of two ultimately, pretty contradictory statements. Everything is suffering, and yet you have to do something about it. And if you do something about it, it can sort of jam a spanner in the works and dismantle this machinery of traumatic experience creation. And effectively, the rest of the text is about that. So in some ways, that's the starting point, although it appears in the middle of the second chapter. The principle, I mean, these are, in some ways, the Buddha's first and third noble truths, that there is this problem of suffering. He then goes on to say it has a cause, but he says there's a possibility of preventing suffering by doing something differently in how we relate to our experience. And so the idea is that because of, really, I think, two particularly important words in Sanskrit: karma, which means action, but is the also consequent mental effect generated by action. So there's a cycle of cause and effect. What we do has an impact on our experience, and that conditions us towards what we do next in order to either capitalize on it, or make amends for it, or respond to it in some way. And the mind is just this engine of processing that information, and these imprints in the mind are known as samskaras, and I think they span generations as well. I mean, certainly in yoga philosophy, the cycle of karma goes on through infinite lifetimes until you can figure your way out of it. And yogic liberation is to step off that spinning wheel. So, in that sense, the samskaras that are sort of influencing what's happening to us now, the grooves in which we're spinning around predictably, have been created by things prior to this lifetime. But what we're doing in this lifetime is certainly shaping our path. And there is, because of the possibility of averting future suffering, the idea that something can be done to smooth off these grooves a little bit so that we're a bit less stuck in them. Instead of them being ditches that we're trying to clamber out of, they're ruts in the road that we can step over. But we are conditioned. There's no real escaping that. And so we inherit through our birth, if you want to talk about this in modern scientific language, DNA, early life experience, inherited stuff through the ways in which our parents, through their DNA and early life experience, are behaving in relation to us, and then all of the social conditioning that shapes the world we grow up into, and then all the factors influencing what kind of a life we have that totally are beyond our control. Which part of the world, what degree of economic affluence, what sort of opportunity, all that's just preconditioned, and it's very hard to sort of erase, otherwise we'd be somebody else. So the problem of yoga really is to come to terms with being the kind of person that we are, which means to face all of this wounding, and to be actually okay with it. And I don't think that means that we become a saint in a sort of ethereal body that hasn't experienced any pain. It means actually, I think, becoming somebody who is okay with the fact that things aren't always okay and haven't been okay and perhaps never will be okay, but is capable of being fully resourced in the face of that and continuing. And perhaps the advanced level is to sort of be able to alchemize that in oneself and in others, and help people into a process of doing something similar. And that's what a great teacher is capable of doing. But as Jacob says, know thyself. Really know the conditioning. And you see this when you sit for an extended meditation retreat where there's nowhere to go except deeper into the recesses of the mind, where all the stuff that we try to push away is buried and comes up, ready to make it quite challenging. And that's the fruit. But do a 90-minute sweaty practice on a yoga mat, and it feels great, and you don't have to face any of that. And there's a sense, knowing myself. I've come up against my physical limitations. I've pushed beyond them. I can now wrap my legs behind my head. I've been there and I've done that, and not only did it not necessarily make me face my trauma, it in fact perpetuated it, because I probably accelerated the onset of arthritis in my hips. So conditioning was there, let's say, and I perhaps didn't face it all that skillfully. So it's all about knowing yourself, and in that sense, that's the where the rubber hits the road with the philosophy, actually seeing things as they are. And so much of our mental machinery is built in such a way as to obscure that possibility. We're distracted, we're agitated, we're confused. All those things happen now on a sort of meta level through the devices like the one we're speaking through. And through them, we inherit everybody else's samskaras, washing over us like waves all day long through so many different distribution channels. I find it hard to remember where I've actually got the information. It's just stuff that came at me today through one portal or another. And so, we need this way of seeing more than ever. We need to somehow titrate that volume of information so that we can keep it manageable. And that's what practices are for. And they involve actually skillfully setting some boundaries and saying, only so much, and then I need to step away. And that's partly, in relation to ourselves. Only so much of my, conditioned tendency to think I know best, and perhaps paying attention to some source of wisdom rather than my own, self-delusion. But also just in relation to the information overload, in relation to, unhelpful ways of relating to ourselves, to each other, and the world. And that's obviously a lot easier said than done.
Yeah, I love that explanation and how you've brought the yoga philosophy or some of those principles down to a much more relatable or practical level. And I'm seeing a question
Hmm.
from Michael Johnson. I don't know if you can read it there, Daniel, in the
I
chat.
might have missed it. Let me scroll back up.
It says, would you say is that klesha is trauma and abhinivesha is PTSD?
Well, yeah, klesha is a fantastic word to bring up. I mean, people like to talk when they talk about the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali about the 8 limbs of yoga, as if that's sort of the organizing framework for yoga philosophy. I mean, it really isn't. Patanjali does sort of structure things into an 8-part system, which is probably very heavily influenced by the fact that the Buddha did the same thing 800 years earlier, and also that 8-part frameworks have become very popular in Indian medicine. And the analysis we were just talking about is the same sort of process a doctor goes through with diagnosis of illness, the recognition that the illness has a cause, the possibility of treating that underlying problem, and then the medicine that's prescribed to make that happen. So that part of the framework is all very clear. But actually, what is being addressed is the kleshas in the mind. Klesha comes from a verbal root klish, which means to torment or to afflict. So yeah, kleshas are experienced traumatically. And the problem is we don't recognize them that way. Patanjali lists 5, um, and 3 of them really are the chief issues that the Buddha also is trying to address. They're rooted in ignorance, which is the first and most powerful, because it's a particularly pernicious kind of ignorance in that we think we know, but we know the wrong thing. Avidya, wrong knowledge, effectively. And the 2 sort of forms that most often takes are lusting after the things that we think are going to provide us with satisfaction, so craving, clinging, and then the opposite, loathing the things that we think cause us pain, aversion, anger, avoidance. And then there are 2 others that Patanjali adds to that, which are really just sort of variations on the same thing. The asmita, which is a word from the verb to be turned into a noun, I amness, basically, the ego, the way that we personalize this whole process of misunderstanding, and build an identity out of likes and dislikes, and therefore come up with a very granular picture of just how things need to be so that we're happy. And of course, I'm as conditioned by that as anybody else. But the point is to try to recognize that. And if we don't, then we experience life as a constant series of afflictions, things that we wanted and didn't get, things that we didn't want that arrived anyway. The world's failure to recognize us in the way that our carefully cultivated self-image suggests that we should be. And then most of all, the last of the list, abhinivesha, which is basically a form of clinging that is so extreme it means trying to hang on to life beyond the possibility of it continuing. So a fear of death, the ultimate aversion, or the ultimate craving to live forever. Totally impossible. And Patanjali says that afflicts even the wise. So, in a sense, yes, it's PTSD, and it's the failure to integrate an understanding of these afflictions and to live in a mind that is conditioned not by afflicted thought, but by unafflicted movements of mental activity, which Patanjali says at the beginning of the text is a possibility, and that's the path to clarity and potentially even to living in the world without so much pain for us and each other. But I would say, though, that perhaps it's more that this abhinivesha is a sign of an inability to be okay with the fact that we are not okay. Um, Nobody really wants to die, and if they do, there are ways to make that happen. But most of us are reluctant to shuffle off this mortal coil. It's a fact of life. The body is trying to sustain itself, and the life force within us is trying to replicate itself. And so this drive for life is part of what it is to be a person. What yoga philosophy is saying is that we misunderstand what that means because we're propelling some sort of forward momentum ever further round the cycle of death and rebirth by projecting into a future rather than actually trying to process a past. So yes, I suppose again in that sense, the failure to learn the lesson means that the possibility of yeah healing from this accumulated trauma is missed. And in that sense, there's a post-traumatic disorder which will continue perhaps into the next lifetime. But I would say actually the PTSD is more of itself the nature of klesha, because these are the symptoms we experience as a result of our unacknowledged and unprocessed and yeah, unintegrated experience of trauma, which we continue to replicate in our ignorance.
Great question, Michael. Thank you. And just
Thank you.
welcoming any further questions, comments uh, about the topics here, or obviously about Daniel's courses and other work that he's engaged with. Yeah, it's great to see so many people in the chat. And yeah, Jacob, thank you for that comment. Know thyself. It's what we strive to support one another to do in our Resonant Man initiative. I'd maybe like to build on that earlier response, which it felt very comprehensive. But I'm wondering if we could once again sort of take it to the collective level, because what you've described, as I'm hearing it, is very much an individual process, or something that is affecting an individual, even maybe an individual soul. I'm not sure whether that will be the kind of language that will be used, but if we're being reincarnated, coming back again and again, it feels like there's some kind of mind stream, something that persists in this philosophy, in this framework. But I wonder whether there could be something happening at a bigger level, at a collective level. Is there anything in yoga philosophy that suggests is always suggestive of a collective consciousness or collective psyche? Because one of the things that we work with in the Thomas Hubel field is this idea of a collective trauma that kind of lives within and between us, almost like a fog that, and it's reminiscent of what you were saying about mechanisms within the mind that shape our or limit our perception that we're actually not aware of. And we think of collective trauma in very similar terms, that our perceptions are being shaped by these collective experiences in ways that we don't notice, but which can be very profound and limiting. And so a large part of the work that we do is try to bring these distorted perceptions into awareness. And we also recognize that that's actually not something that you can do on your own as an individual, especially if we're talking about imprints from wars or genocides or colonialism or these huge historical forces that we recognize as living in each of us in a unique kind of fingerprint way. But is there a collective consciousness that's going through this process? Is there some kind of bigger evolutionary impulse that our species is involved in, or is that something that's been kind of layered on top of these texts by more modern readers?
Well, I think you raise a fascinating question there, just in the framing of it at the end. Whatever we do today is reframing ancient texts, even if we're trying to the best of our ability to respect their words to the letter, because we live in 2025 at the moment of recording. But
Fortunately, yeah.
we can't rewind to 2,000 years ago or beyond, and step into a different culture and a different sort of life potential. So we're inevitably adjusting based on the knowledge that humanity has accumulated in our particular corner of the planet. And these days, with the globalized nature of things, and sort of, as it was called when we were teenagers, the information superhighway.
The interweb. Yes.
Indeed. And so there is this sort of confluence of stuff that makes it almost impossible to step out of modernity in that respect. But we can, I think, be respectful in our engagement with things. And sometimes the most respectful thing we can do is to acknowledge that they're saying different things to what we would like them to talk about. Um, and to see why they're doing that, and to understand that there might have been a different project. And the easiest way to illustrate that is to, grapple head on with this question of, karma and rebirth. And honestly, I don't think the vast majority of Western yoga practitioners who are going to yoga studios decided to go there in order to get off the cycle of births. They're there for other purposes.
That's
That's
level
okay.
two. Yeah,
Well, I mean, it
exactly.
might just not be on the radar. It just might not be how they see things. But
Yeah,
that is where these teachings came from. And if you
yeah.
were to rewind 2,000 years and say, well, I'm up for the practices, guys, but none of that sort of weird mystical woo-woo. They'd say, well, what are you talking about? The practices are just a way of implementing this understanding so as to, avoid what it is trying to address, that will otherwise carry on, for infinite numbers of lifetimes. And so, that's one thing. I mean, that's just one very crude example, but it requires us to try on for size what it might have meant to see the world that way, and to understand that if that is the most pressing problem, that we're going to come back, perhaps the most extreme methods of trying to jam a spanner in the works are sanctioned, because the yogi's ultimate project is to make this the last lifetime. And the earliest version of that it was very extreme. It's be no one, do nothing, and be comfortable with perhaps just letting go of everything. Obviously, if you've not purified all of this stuff that's accumulated within you, then you're just generating more forward momentum, and you'll be back for the next round. But if you have seen through the illusion, there is that possibility. So that's one thing I want to say up front, that seeing that that's very different and learning to see through another perspective can be helpful, if only to say, well, that's not how I look at things. And therefore, if I'm going to try to find inspiration from these sources, I'm going to have to admit that I'm doing some reinterpreting here, rather than pretending that Patanjali meant rainbows and unicorns. So we have to, I think, be open to that first of all. Secondly, we need to acknowledge that there's a huge variety of teachings from ancient India that have had some bearing on what we now understand as yoga. And there's also a load of other influences that have contributed to what is today taught and practiced under the heading of yoga, particularly in relation to working with the body in this sort of sequence of contortions manner, some of which may or may not have even come from India. But that again, well,
I
part.
thought half of them came from Sweden, having read your book.
Well, that's the sort of let's say unfiltered version of a scholarly argument that was made about 15 years ago, initially in a book called Yoga Body by Mark Singleton, where he was analyzing the close similarity between some of the shapes made in European systems of calisthenics and those taught in modern postural yoga, for which there was no record in earlier yoga texts. And so he was saying, at that time, late 19th, early 20th century in India, the combination of various factors, particularly resistance to colonial rule, the rediscovery of physical methods, a resistance to being taught these systems of calisthenics, in schools that were basically, replications of British imperial, muscular Christianity training for particularly the Indian elite, and the desire to promote indigenous knowledge and to show it was at least the equal to, if not superior to, these Western systems. And physical yoga really, accelerates in its development under those sort of influences. May perhaps have borrowed some things from martial traditions of calisthenics, burpees, squat thrusts, and the like. But there were also strands of that sort of thing in India as well, in the form of wrestling training and indigenous martial arts. So the jury's out exactly on what comes from where, but that's definitely the cultural context. But yes, I mean, we're sort of, before we disappear down the rabbit hole of where did all the shapes come from, there is this sort of evolution. Things keep changing. And so I just wanted to acknowledge all that up front before I then say, yes, well, if we go right back to the very beginning of the texts that spawn the ideas that influence yoga practice, the earliest of the Upanishads, we find there stated very clearly that if you truly know yourself, you are the cosmos. There is nothing other than the totality. You're just experiencing it in a limited way through your personal misunderstanding. And even if you're out there, conducting rituals venerating gods, you're deluded, because there is no distinction between any of it at the ultimate level. And so, we can obviously fast forward to the evolution of modern physics and start to see some similarities once we get down below the subatomic level, in the fact that there's just things that are in flux. And the tantric philosophies in particular of medieval India, which come along, sort of 1,000 years later, but borrow a lot of the ideas in the Upanishads, talk about this, energetic pulsation that is, the root of all experience, and that actually consciousness is the purest, undistilled sort of substrate of that. And so, if we really understand the energetic impulse in everything, there's nothing to turn away from. There's nowhere else to go. We are it. It is us. And in that sense, the we are the cosmos worldview gets a system upgrade. And then physical yoga develops from that. The idea that the body isn't the enemy, you can harness it. And obviously it goes off, down a tangent into yoga for health and well-being, rather than mastery of the cosmic forces by which the Big Bang originally occurred, which is effectively what that worldview is talking about. There's a focus in yoga on the cultivation of powers, the channeling of power, the empowerment of the body. So to that extent, yes, there is this understanding at the collective level, but there isn't really, apart from the philosophy that's expressed in the Bhagavad Gita, which is much more about dharma than it is about yoga, if we're really honest. It's using yogic ideas for the promotion of dharma. Dharma being an ancient Indian word, again, hard to translate. Basically means doing the right thing in lots of different forms, following the rules, doing your duty, embodying virtue, crusading for justice. All of that would come under the heading of dharma. And the Gita is trying to say that actually, if we really understand the nature of reality, there's nowhere to turn away to anyway. It would just be avoiding life. So what we need to do is fully embrace the doing of our duty in service of the bigger picture. That can be structured as a devotional practice, offering it all to God. It can be structured as a sort of rationalist practice of not adding to the problem of suffering by trying to satisfy our desires, and instead doing the exact opposite by being generous and giving things away in acts of service, and seeing it all as playing our part in a bigger picture. We can, of course, at this point digress into social and political history and observe that was very convenient to some people in the sort of social hierarchy of ancient India, because it meant that people wouldn't disappear to the forest, but would continue doing the work that was needed to keep society going, while at the same time rehabilitating the idea of making offerings to the gods on the part of the priests, and being active rulers who might have to engage in warfare at difficult times for the purpose of upholding dharma. Both of those things having been called into question by this transcendent anarchist shift in perspective worldview that the yogis were embodying. So everything is kind of complicated in that sense. But to come back to where we were before, just to wrap it all up, kleshas. I edited a book called McMindfulness a few years ago, which was really trenchant critique of the modern mindfulness industry by an American academic who was saying that it's okay. I mean, it makes people feel better in the moment, but it's stripped out the most transformative part of Buddhism, which is to deal with these three core afflictions. The poisons of greed, ill will, and illusion or ignorance, and craving, aversion, avidya, same story. And he was trying to point out that there are societal expressions of this as well. And so not only by failing to deal with that comprehensively as part of how mindfulness is presented, are you actually doing the opposite of what the Buddha suggested, which is basically get people more identified with self-care and concern for themselves, and perhaps not therefore dismantling that layer of attachment to identity, but also neglecting the fact that these things are replicated on a massive level in society at large, and not talking about the structural problems in the way that societies, economies, and military forces are organized geopolitically or at the very local level, to perpetuate harm. And if you're not going to use this awareness to try to engage with all of that, you're basically just kind of giving yourself a happy pill and letting it all carry on. So that was his critique. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. It's very easy to go down a culture war rabbit hole with it and just get into a shouting match about, who's the biggest sort of avoider of the world's most important issues. But I also think it's important because it extends the analysis of the glaciers beyond our limited personal experience and starts to look societally at how these mind matters are showing up. Because if they are bigger than us anyway, and we are being conditioned by things beyond us, the only way to address all of that is in relationship to everything else anyway. Patanjali wasn't interested in that because he was a fundamentalist. He's like, go to the cave, stop doing anything that causes problems, don't interact with the world. You will eventually find a way to sort of purify this stream if you're really diligent. Whereas if we're not going to go to the cave, we've got to sort of upgrade our entanglements, and we've got to have healthier relationships and figure out, how to make limited improvements, even if we can't stop humanity from careering off the edge of a cliff. We can do our best to make our little corner of this messy planet a little less messy.
It feels like a beautiful place to begin to draw our dialogue to a close. You bridged very elegantly the individual practice, or the focus on individual healing, I might say, or purification, but also connected it to that much bigger level, the collective level that we began our discussion exploring. And thank you to those who've just joined us in the last few minutes. I'm sorry that we're about to wrap up. You will be able to catch the replay, though, which I highly recommend. And thank you, Claudia, for your comment. Culture is not a fixed system. It's rather shaped by changing human interacting experiences. That seems
100%.
Yeah,
100%.
what Daniel's been saying. But as we close, maybe you could just briefly say something about the courses that you're offering. I believe your doors are opening again in September, if I'm right.
That's correct. Thank you. I
Yeah.
appreciate you reminding me. I'm actually not very good at this kind of thing. This course, The Path of Knowledge, about which you can find more at truthofyoga.com, is a year-long immersion in the history and philosophy of yoga, but by no means as dry as that makes it sound. It's a way of engaging with everything that we've been talking about, just through the prism of trying to use chronology and distinctions between philosophical systems to make it manageable. So over 20 modules, we break things down into the building blocks of the worldviews that have influenced yoga practice, and start to see how yoga has been in a process of evolution since its earliest origins. We don't really know where it comes from. We just can chart the moment that it first appears in some form that's been handed down to us. And we can start to see how it interacts with other systems of knowledge and what it borrows and how that changes things. And we can also then start to think about how we, by interacting with that stream of knowledge that's come over the millennia to us, are going to be changing things too, and to start to think much more responsibly about questions related to authenticity or appropriation. Not by some dogmatic checklist of, here are the 10 steps to be an appreciator instead of an appropriator, but to have, an honest philosophical path of inquiry for ourselves about what makes meaning. How do we orient that in some way to an idea that has some connection to traditions of yoga? And if we're not actually interested in that, why do we call it yoga in the first place? And to have that as a sort of, kind of post-it note sort of stuck kind of somewhere in the background, hanging over everything, while we just discuss how we relate to these different ideas and techniques and systems of knowledge that emerge over time, and with a view to, at the end, articulating in some way some personal expression of what we've learned through that process, which can take the form of some writing and some sort of structured analysis of things, or can go completely off piste. Can be developing a workshop that might teach something that's perhaps only tangentially related to what's been learned, but is influenced by the crystallization of clarity around what it is we're doing and why that has emerged through the process. Or it might just be a poem. It might be a piece of music or artwork. But the idea is to have the opportunity to, with some support, reflect on how these things shape us, and then how we are in our own life and teaching, perhaps, or just practice or experience, shaping what yoga will be in years to come, because we are stewards of this living tradition. And I think that's something to be engaged with wholeheartedly, and with great interest in what's come before, but without the sense that we're obliged necessarily to take any of it on board if it doesn't speak to us. But at least knowing what's there makes it easier to decide for ourselves what it is that influences us. So that's why I've called it the path of knowledge. It is quite a long path, but the wonderful thing about it is it's a community, and we meet every 2 weeks for conversations, a little like this, but a little bit more split into smaller groups, and then coming into a larger group with some structured guidance relating to the module's contents, and hopefully providing opportunities for questions to be answered, for dissenting opinions to be expressed, for polarities to be integrated within a larger whole that can absorb disagreement. In fact, I think the most yogic thing we could do in the modern world is agree to disagree, rather than assuming that for me to be feeling that I'm okay with my view, I somehow have to make yours go away. But now I'm off on one, so I'll leave it there. But if anybody has questions, if you're watching this on the replay, you'll be presumably seeing it through my Substack, Ancient Futures. Otherwise, at truthofyoga.com, you can send me an email. I'd be very happy to answer any questions, or to set up a brief call to talk anything through, to help you decide if this is something for you. And if it does feel that way, I would love for you to join us. We start in, what is it now? Just a month. 21st of September is our first live session. So have a look, see if it speaks to you, and maybe see you soon.
Yeah, and a lovely comment from Alison here. I highly recommend Daniel's course. Critical thinking really encouraged. You can follow your own interests that may be outside of a yoga world. So yeah, it sounds amazing. Sounds like an amazing course. I know from what you were telling me about the first round you ran last year, how rich and rewarding it was. So yeah, that's something I highly recommend people explore further. Thanks, Daniel. And yeah, it's been wonderful to have this dialogue. I feel like I've expanded my understanding of where the world of yoga philosophy can really help clarify and enrich the kind of collective healing work that I've been studying. And I think there's more for us to explore. It feels like the conversation is just starting. So I hope we can do this again soon.
I would love to, yes. And maybe we can take turns.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Great to see you. Appreciate those questions.
Thank
Cheers.
you.